Hi everyone and welcome. My name is Daniela Caruso, Director of the Center for the Study of Europe, which is housed in the Perju School of Global Studies at Boston University. It is my pleasure to introduce a wonderful friend and a wonderful colleague, Vivien Schmidt, who is now in Italy, which is dangerously close to her bedtime, and nevertheless willing to talk with us about her new book tonight. Here's the book. I wish I had a stand, but the artwork is by Vivien herself, and it's gorgeous.
Oh, wow.
Vivien Schmidt is Jean Monnet Professor of European Integration and Professor of International Relations and Political Science at Boston University. She is also the founder and longtime director of this very center, a fact that makes this occasion particularly meaningful for us. Her research focuses on European political economy, institutions, democracy, and political theory, in particular on the importance of ideas and discourse in political analysis. Her 2006 volume, Democracy in Europe, was named by the European Parliament as one of the 100 books on Europe to remember. Her many honors and awards include a Guggenheim Fellowship, a European Union Studies Lifetime Achievement Award, and the title of Chevalier in the French Legion of Honor. Her current work focuses on the rhetoric of discontent and involves a transatlantic investigation of the populist revolt. The subject of this event is Vivien's just released book, Europe's Crisis of Legitimacy, Governing by Rules and Ruling by Numbers in the Eurozone, a publication of Oxford University Press. Here it is again for those who didn't see it before. To guide us through this book, we have with us three distinguished discussants whom I will briefly introduce in alphabetical order. Mark Blyth is the William Rhodes Professor of International Economics, Political Science, and International and Public Affairs at Brown University. He is also director of the Rhodes Center for International Economics and Finance. Professor Blyth is a political economist who investigates how uncertainty and randomness impact economic systems and why people, and I'm quoting, continue to believe stupid economic ideas despite buckets of evidence to the contrary. Among his many books, I will just mention one which is quite relevant to our discussion this evening. The title is Austerity, the History of a Dangerous Idea. Next is Vlad Perju, director of the Clough Center for the Study of Constitutional Democracy at Boston College and professor of law at Boston College Law School. Professor Perju's research and teaching interests include the law of the European Union, comparative law, constitutional law, and modern legal theory. In 2008, Professor Perju was appointed by the President of Romania to a 7-member Commission on Constitutional Reform and remains actively involved in the practice and theory of European constitutional democracy. His writings include the prize-winning article Reason and Authority in the European Court of Justice, published in 2009. I've noticed, Vivien, that at page 297 of your book, you talk about Romanian brain drain. Professor Perju may be one of the examples of that problem and issue. Last in alphabetical order, but certainly not least, is Philomila Tsoukala, Professor of Law at Georgetown University. Professor Tsoukala teaches in the areas of family law, European Union law, and legal theory. Her research interests focus on the place of law in the political economy of Western liberal states, with special emphasis on market regulation and on the use of family law in the construction of national identities. She has written extensively about the recent European crisis from the perspective of family and welfare law, warning about the permanent transformation of the European Union through crisis management. Her 2015 article, Household Regulation and European Integration, The Family Portrait of a Crisis, won a prize from the American Society of Comparative Law. It is my pleasure to introduce this discussion, and I look very much forward to everybody's contribution. Thank you. Vivien, will you please address the crowd? Thanks.
Yes, so I'm going to share my screen. So my book is essentially focused on Europe's crisis of legitimacy. It's something that I've worked on for a very long time, and certainly intensely for the previous 5 years. So delighted it's out and really delighted to be able to talk to you about it. So what is Europe's Euro crisis of legitimacy? This is a crisis not just about economics or politics, it's also about legitimacy. And it's about what happened in 2010 with the Eurozone crisis, when EU actors decided that they would govern by rules and rule by numbers. And what happened was legitimacy was increasingly at risk as a result of deteriorating economics and increasingly toxic politics, rise of populism, among other things. So what you saw is that things didn't stop there. The response between 2013 and 2015 is that EU actors, recognizing that it was not going well, started reinterpreting the rules and recalculating the numbers. But they did this by stealth. The result is you had incremental improvement, but suboptimal rules and perceptions of illegitimacy, as EU actors kept denying that what they were doing was indeed increasingly flexible sort of reinterpretations of the rules. By 2015, actually, EU actors began saying, yes, actually, we have been reinterpreting the rules. This is about increasing flexibility, but by then the damage had been done. And that's essentially the thesis of the book. So what we need to do, given that we're talking about legitimacy, is how do we define legitimacy? The first and most basic way of thinking about legitimacy is as governing authority. It's people's essentially putting trust in a public body, in a political body, and giving it thereby authority. But legitimacy is only just about this sort of very basic, almost Weberian notion. It's also about legitimacy as a governing activity. And in fact, as often as not, how do you ensure legitimacy as governing authority? It's by continuing to have governing activity that is itself legitimate. And there are three ways of thinking about governing activity, and I'll go into greater detail on this later, but it's about policy effectiveness, political responsiveness, and procedural quality of governance. So we need to ask the question, is the EU democratically legitimate as a governing authority? Well, I would actually say yes. Slowly but surely, in policy area after policy area, the EU was at least tacitly accepted as a governing authority by EU citizens, and certainly by the member states involved. Is the EU a democracy? Well, not in any traditional sense of democracy from the national level, but its member states are democracy, and the EU is in many ways its member states. But what about is the EU democratic legitimate as in terms of its governing activity? This became a serious problem during the Eurozone crisis. So how do we think more deeply about legitimacy in terms of the EU's governing activity? Well, first, we need to think about legitimacy, already mentioned, as political, performance, and procedural. In EU studies systems theory terms, it's about output legitimacy, which is a performance criterion, thus policy effectiveness and performance. It's about input legitimacy, which is a political criterion. So that's about representation, participation, political elites' responsiveness to citizens. And in terms of these two criteria, or two legitimizing mechanisms, if you will, output and input are often seen as trade-offs. If the people have not voted for this, but the policy works well, then it's generally seen as legitimate. By the same token, if the people have voted for something really stupid and it doesn't work, it's nonetheless legitimate. So that's when we think about the trade-offs. But what about throughput legitimacy, which is procedural criterion? And this is about the quality of the processes. And these are criteria that are often talked about separately, but in fact they fit all under this procedural criterion, which is about efficacy, accountability, transparency, inclusiveness, and openness. And here, and it's important, there are no trade-offs, or certainly not the same kinds of trade-offs, which means that if you have good procedural legitimacy, it's almost invisible. But if it's bad, if it's incompetent, unfair, appears oppressive, or whatever, then it actually can taint the input, and it can skew the output. So essentially, highly problematic. And in the Eurozone crisis in particular, what we saw is EU actors assumed that there were indeed trade-offs, that all they had to do was governed by the rules and ruled by the numbers, i.e. double down on the procedural legitimacy aspects, assuming that if we've got good throughput, then we'll have good output performance, and therefore it doesn't matter if the citizens are not involved. They were wrong. So another last theoretical slide about the EU level. How do we think about input, output, and throughput in the EU? Because I gave you three terms, three kind of legitimacy mechanisms that are very general. In the EU, what you have is a kind of split level legitimacy, where at the European Union level, for the most part, actors end up with output legitimacy because they're focused on performance, in particular supranational actors, and throughput legitimacy, focus on the procedures. And it's at the national level that you have input legitimacy. Now, it's of course true, you have the European Parliament where there's a certain amount of input legitimacy, political legitimacy, but generally speaking, people vote for national leaders, for national governments, which are then represented at the EU level. So it's a split level issue, which is actually very problematic for democracy in the member states as well, which we can get to in a minute. And what has happened in terms of Eurozone governance is that we've seen increasing politicization, i.e. concerns by citizens about a lack of national political input. So politicization at the bottom has led to growing Euroscepticism. You end up with politicization from the bottom up, what EU scholars have talked about as a move from a permissive consensus to an increasingly constraining dissensus. And you see that amongst member state leaders in the council, where agreements are harder and harder to find. But generally speaking, politicization is also simply at the top, and we see a new politicized dynamics of interaction. And also more and more conflict between the council that assumes it's in charge, the Commission and the ECB that actually have a tremendous amount of control, and also the European Parliament with greater influence. And in the Eurozone crisis, what you've seen is increasing contestation, certainly debate, deliberation, but also contestation. And I guess the question is this a good thing or a bad thing? And you could say that politicization, in particular during the Eurozone crisis, was a bad thing in terms of the content of the discourse, as council, member state leaders in the council, Finance Minister Wolfgang Schäuble accused the Commission of being out of bounds and saying, I'm going to push for an independent agency, and because you're not being legitimate, you're too political. The Commission shooting back, in particular after 2015, well, we are a political body, and that's fine. So problematic in terms of the content, because the content of the discourse could be seen as delegitimizing, but actually in terms of the process, you could argue that this is a good thing, because actually this is what all democracies look like. Constant debate and contestation amongst all parties. We see it at the national level all the time. That is in a way what democracy is. So you could argue maybe politicization is actually a good thing. So now I'm going to move on to each of the different pathways to legitimacy of each of the EU actors. We're going to be starting with the council, and what I'm going to be doing in each case, and very quickly, is talking about the kind of Janus face views of the different actors. When you talk about legitimacy, it's not legitimate really for me to say, oh, this is right, that's wrong. I want to take people through all the arguments on both sides and ask the question, where is legitimacy? So in terms of the council, the question is the council a dictatorship led by Germany with one size fits one rules, i.e. fits Germany best? And we look at what happens in the council, even though EU member state leaders often think of this as a representative forum. I represent my citizens, you represent your citizens. Actually, this is not, they're not elected to the EU. They're elected at the national level, and they make decisions for everyone, and sometimes with a gun at people's head. So it's also not a throughput accountability forum, in that there is no forum, there's no one to hold them to account, including the European Parliament. Whereas at the national level, generally, governments are held accountable by parliaments. And on top of it, if we think about dictatorship led by Germany, Germany essentially, and these are the arguments, basically got its way in terms of the economics, its political interests. Constitutional Court was the only one that was consistently intervening. And then in the first 2 years of Merkozy, it was Merkel essentially leading Sarkozy. So that's the argument for the council as a dictator. But you could also say, actually, maybe the council was a deliberative body, a mutually accountable deliberative body that engaged in a tremendous amount of legitimation, of deliberation. After all, everyone did agree on the rules, even though deliberation was in the shadow of Germany. And if you look over time, there's a discourse of stability. Everyone has to follow the stability rules in 2010. But by 2012, Mario Monti comes and says, we want growth. President Hollande says, okay, we want growth. And Merkel agrees to growth 2012. Flexibility comes in 2014 as Matteo Renzi pushes for flexibility. Hollande agrees and Merkel says, oh, okay, flexibility within the stability rules. And by 2015, you get a push for investment. So you could argue that this is a deliberative body. However, when it comes to the Troika, when it comes to the program countries, the only thing you can ask is, was it harsh dictatorship, as in the third Greek bailout, or maybe deliberative authoritarianism? So that's the council. Next, the European Central Bank. Was it a hero of the crisis or an ogre? As a hero in terms of monetary policy, it did go from one size fits none rules to whatever it takes in 2012, and Mario Draghi's famous statement, and it basically hides its reinterpretation of the rules in plain view. It goes from Trichet's very narrow discussion of his mandate and saying, oh, we can't be in a lender of last resort. It's all about credibility. Increasingly with Mario Draghi, he goes to, it's about stability in the medium term, and we go all the way to quantitative easing by 2015. So this is also more about not just output performance, but making things work, but also throughput accountability, using expert networks on the outside, informal political consultation to get everyone on board. So that's the hero side. But as an ogre, it was the ECB that pushed austerity and structural reform. And there was a lack of accountability on its quid pro quo in terms of fiscal consolidation, certainly a lack of transparency. Jean-Claude Trichet's secret letters pushing countries into conditionality, so basically saying, I'm pulling the plug on you, Ireland, etc., unlike Italy, if you don't do something. And of course, there's a lack of efficacy. It's way too long on becoming a lender of last resort and quantitative easing. The Commission, ayatollahs of austerity, enforcers in the European semester's one-size-fits-all policies, and in the Troika, it was an enforcer for the Eurogroup. Or perhaps they're ministers of moderation, certainly from 2013 on. They were clearly found themselves between a rock, Northern Europe, and a hard place, Southern Europe. And as performance fails, what you see is the Commission becomes increasingly flexible. And you also see it in its annual growth surveys. What it says in these reports really change massively over time. But in these 2013 to 2015, Commissioner Olli Rehn's discourse is still Ayatollah-like, basically saying it's all about austerity and structural reform, even though France and Italy were getting derogations on the rules. Spain was allowed to recalculate the numbers, etc. And the Eurogroup Commission, starting in 2015, tells the truth about flexibility, although it's still into rules and rules for flexibility. And the Parliament, I'm not going to go into, talking shop with no size at all or increasingly equal partner. One thing you could say is that it increasingly became the go-to body for input legitimacy for the ECB, but also the Commission. And what about output legitimacy? Again, I'm going to go very fast with this. you need austerity, a history of a very bad idea, because this is really, the problems with the Eurozone crisis. It was failures in framing. It was a private debt crisis, but the framing was its public debt. Therefore, the diagnosis was it was a behavioral problem, whereas in fact it was the structural problem of the euro. And the result was a bad choice of remedies, double down on the rules, and a lack of solutions. No fiscal solidarity, no Eurobonds, no European Monetary Fund, and on and on and on. The result, problems in policy performance and outcomes, which I'm not going to go into now. But it wasn't only on the economic policy, it's also in terms of input legitimacy, political legitimacy. We see, and here's the proof that this was really a problem, not only the proof that we saw in terms of what happened in the economics, but also in the politics, rising Euroscepticism, declining trust, increasingly negative image of the EU, new cleavages, the sources of discontent, we all know about it, the socioeconomics of people left behind, the sociocultural problems of loss of status, anti-immigration that comes with it, and the politics of take back control, as we know, in terms of Brexit, and increasing political polarization, decline of mainstream parties, and the rise of the populist Eurosceptic extremes. How do we reform the Eurozone? Actually, what's wonderful is, so I'm not going to go through this really, we can come back to it if you'd like, but essentially some of these, and certainly in terms of fiscal solidarity, the COVID crisis, COVID-19 crisis has changed things massively. So I'm just going to go straight to the COVID-19 slide. What about applying these as tools for analysis to COVID-19? What about legitimacy during the crisis? Initially, this was the Eurozone crisis, déjà vu, all over again. The Council was unaccountable. It failed to act as member states pursued their own policies. The ECB claimed it wasn't its mandate to deal with spreads between German and Italian bonds. The European Parliament played no role. The Commission was nowhere. And on top of that, it also looked like the migration crisis redux as national level borders went up. And yet, very quickly thereafter, we see better procedural legitimacy, better performance. The member states end their budgetary austerity with big infusions. This is a complete wiping out of the rules of the Eurozone. The Council, the Franco-German duo is back as a mutually accountable deliberative body. No more dictatorship by Germany. The ECB looks like a hero without ogre-like austerity and structural reform policies, engages in massive bond buying, and the Commission end up as ministers of moderation. No hint of Ayatollahs here. They suspend the budgetary criteria, state aid. They have a whole range of other initiatives. So what next? Well, there's still some way to go. The populist revolt is not over. Governing by rules and ruling by numbers of the Eurozone have only been suspended. They have not been officially revoked. And the Eurozone still, and here we can talk about the lack of the completion of banking union, the lack of a serious backstop, and no independent individual deposit insurance, and on and on and on. Nonetheless, the response to the COVID-19 crisis reverses some of the worst legitimacy lapses of the Eurozone. Certainly the European Recovery Fund is a massive innovation. So at least what we see is a good start. Thank you.
Wonderful, Vivien. Thank you so much for this. It's always such a lucid rendition of a very complicated story. I would like to let Mark now comment on the book before. Yes, please.
So delighted to take part in this. And Vivien, first of all, two things. That's the first time I've seen you come in exactly on the time you were allocated in the presentation. So that's fabulous. I will do exactly the same thing. The second thing is you stole my thunder. I was going to use COVID and the current crisis to make exactly the same point. So now I'm going to have to wing around that. So forgive me while I try and do this. So I know the book very well because the original kernel of this was a chapter in a book I did a while ago called The Future of the Euro. And looking back on that book now in the reflection of Vivien's book, I realized that the future of the Euro was the wrong focus. Ultimately, the Euro works because it's the Hotel California. You can check in, but you can't check out. Now, that may seem like a bad thing, but what it does is it encourages a certain degree of recognition that everyone's fate hangs together. And I think that's the part that I want to stress here. Italy has no functioning growth model. It hasn't had for 20 years. It's not as simple as joining the euro killed you. It's much more complex than that. They have the third biggest bond market in the world and the 17th biggest economy. And they're the only country in the OECD where, despite negative rates on bonds, they're actually growing less than the rate of growth in the debt stock. So Europe has to take care of that problem. And in doing so, Europe does more than the individual actors that comprise it. I think that's the bit that I missed in my Euro story. I also got bored with institutions. The whole sort of focus on the institutions, I just couldn't deal with that sort of stuff. I was interested in populism and the fact that people didn't want more integration and the whole thing was in stasis. I think I was wrong about that too. And ultimately, it is about legitimacy. In 2015, the question was, how does the EU bounce back after the defenestration of Greece? How do you possibly legitimate your action after such appalling behaviour? Well, I think that they have. And I think the key here, and this is what Vivien points out very well with her analysis, is it's not that legitimacy matters. Everyone knows this. It's not just that legitimacy can be lost. Everybody knows this. Look at the United States. Here's the lesson. Legitimacy can be garnered if you exhibit the capacity to learn. And that's the surprising part. That the EU, as a set of institutions and a set of actors, actually has the capacity to learn. And we have clear evidence that that is the case. Back in the bad old days, I used to call the EU, especially the Commission, the Bourbons, because they learned nothing and forgot nothing. But what Vivien shows us is that these institutions can learn. And they do that basically by reinterpreting what the rules mean. That is the first step in the analysis. So I'll do a similar but different periodization to what Vivien did and talk about output, input, and throughput. So in terms of output legitimacy, the heyday of output legitimacy was 1999 to 2006, because it was all going well. You had convergence, north-south transfers. The German banks were lending the Spanish real estate developers the money to build the houses that the German tourists would go to in exchange for BMWs, et cetera, et cetera. The vendor financing years. And that is a vulnerable way to run an economy. It's inherently imbalanced. It depends on capital flows, which can be subject to sudden stops, and that's exactly what happened. So that form of legitimacy was always fragile. Then there's input legitimacy, as Vivien pointed out. The EU is not a classic polity. The EU is not a country. So any version of democracy, even with an elected parliament, is attenuated, constrained. And that wasn't really a problem so long as you had output legitimacy. But once you hit the austerity years, you have a problem because you have the broadening and deepening of the political role of the Council and the Commission. But what Vivien shows us is that first they double down on the rules because that's where you get your legitimacy from. But then they actually learn. They know that this isn't working. And that's incredibly important because then they go, okay, well, we can't actually just come out and say, hey, we got it all wrong. Let's not do this austerity stuff. It doesn't work. But what we will do is we'll actually begin in practice to just really reverse what we do. Draghi is the most obvious example. I will do whatever it takes, ... within my mandate. In other words, I just totally reinterpreted the mandate. But exactly as Vivien also points out, when you start to see the shift from growth, the new emphasis on green investment, the investment on the increased attention on investment itself, it tells us that this is changing, that the wrapper may be the same, that the fiscal rules may be there, that the six-pack and the two-pack and all that sort of stuff is there. But really, at the end of the day, it doesn't matter, because this is actually a much more flexible and adaptive set of institutions than I thought that it was. So this brings me back to throughput, right? Procedure. Because it's not just procedure, it's how you rewire the institutions, it's how you replumb them. You go beyond governing by the rules and ruling by the numbers. You rewrite the rules that give you legitimacy by allowing them to adapt to the world rather than be broken by them. In a way, one of my favorite books is Nassim Taleb's Anti-Fragile. And I used to think that the EU was a very fragile set of institutions. That is, it wasn't resilient to shocks. It didn't gain from shocks. But actually, and this is what I'll bring in COVID, I think that it's an anti-fragile set of institutions because in comparison to the Anglosphere in comparison to countries like Brazil, in comparison to Russia, even in comparison to China. Everything is, let's lock everything down. The EU response is very, very different. Let's think about this, just a few examples. No vaccine nationalism, recognition of the integrated nature of health systems. The need for common unemployment insurance in response to macro shocks is now no longer contestable. That is recognized and is going to happen in short order. Building actual fiscal muscle, the 750 billion COVID fund, sure, it's only 390 billion in grants, but those are transfers. This is not a transfer union, is now dead. That is over. And even the Dutch have abandoned austerity because ordinary Dutch voters have figured out that it's just a gimme to corporations and tax dodges, and no one has any more appetite for this. There will be in the short term to medium term no return to austerity. In fact, I hope there's no return ever. But no one is coming out and saying that the way we're going to get out of this is by tightening our belts and the confidence fairy will apply. What it is and what it requires is investment. And if you look at the new financial framework, the 7-year budget, 1.1 trillion in real investment, 1/3 of which is for the green transition, and 1/3 of which is for a digital rebuild of the European digital infrastructure. That is serious. If you'd said to me 10 years ago, would that be on the cards? Not a chance. Underneath the hood, even more important things are going on. Philip Lane at the ECB, the chief economist, a big fan of dual rates. Dual rates seems rather technical, but essentially it's a way of getting German savers off your back by giving them a positive return and doing targeted lending for energy transition by giving a negative rate to targeted loans. And the ECB takes the spread between the two. How can it pay for this over the long run? It takes equity shares in the projects that it funds, or it takes some kind of taxes back once these things are actually earning yield. All of this is actually happening now, and that itself is very positive. And they need to do this because, you know what, the neighborhood is changing. China is not just a passive investor. Russia is a permanent meddler. Libya is a headache. Turkey is a bully. And the USA is not the country you once thought it was. Not yet in security, but in every other way, the EU is learning and it is getting there. Given this, if I were to write the future of the euro again, I wouldn't actually focus on the euro. I would focus, as Vivien has done, on the institutions. And I would view those institutions and the role of legitimacy, not in the rear view mirror as she did, but as something that keeps the EU alive and fresh in the current moment. And in a period in which, if I have to choose between Trumpism and China, the EU suddenly appears to be a beacon of hope that I never thought it would be. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. So let's gather more comments and then we'll hear from Vivien and open it up for debate. Vlad, your response, please.
Thank you, and thank you to Vivien for writing this book. I have learned an enormous deal from it. It's an extraordinary achievement. Thank you for not getting bored with the institutions. And I found it compelling, informative, and extremely honest. And I think this really came through in the way that you have presented it. I will start by saying a few words about legitimacy, about input and output, and how procedure comes in. I think that as you very nicely presented, what legitimacy looked like before the turn to procedure, so to speak, was that you have sort of the input and the output, and the very choice between which frame to use in legitimacy discourses was highly politicized, was highly political. These were not sort of neutral options. It was rather clear that the choice for the input framework had been used very effectively from the left, from the right, to put supranationalism on the defensive. There's no European demos, there's no seriously structured democratic will at the supranational level, limited representativeness of EU institutions, you've got a very weak and ever struggling for relevance European Parliament, low turnout for European Parliament elections, so on and so forth. You open any of the relevant judgments of the German Constitutional Court regarding the kind of interface between the Germany and the EU, and including a the PSPP one, a recent and very relevant decision of the German court to the story that you're telling, the one that came down after the book was published. And you basically see this kind of claim, the claim that it was Germany, and Germany here really stands for any of the member states to have been the first to plant the flag of democracy in the European territory. Of course, this is quite ironic, at least when it comes from Germany, and it is not, and it is a rather ridiculous claim, historically speaking, but nevertheless, it's a very powerful discursive framework, one that has very much structured the understanding and the self-understanding of the member states and of the EU. Now, conversely, sort of attempts to rescue supranational legitimacy have sought to move away from the input talk and then to emphasize the output dimension by arguing that what the EU manages to deliver, at least on occasion, sort of vastly outweighs any of the quite serious input imperfections. And sometimes some of this output discourse has really downplayed the whole point of thinking in terms of input. Many voices have been arguing that even thinking about something like democratic will or democratic input is really passé. We should really think in terms of what these institutions or institutional structures can deliver. Now, granted, there's always been some disagreement, some great difficulty coming up with how to frame the output really and what the purpose of the whole enterprise is. But that being said, there's, I guess, enough on the output side that a discourse has been able to to carry on. Now, of course, it's always, as an aside, it's always been rather baffling to me to believe that to believe in this kind of exclusive emphasis on output legitimacy with regard to supranational action, to sort of give up on the input legitimacy. No, it seems very hard to see how any, modern European thought being what it is, it seems very hard that the legitimacy of a political project can be established while bracketing away altogether any kind of self-government democratic aspect of that project. So to this scene comes the sort of the turn to procedure. If this had been published in a law review, in a law journal, I think it would have been called the turn to procedure. And it's incredibly interesting. It's really interesting. It's actually fascinating. And you can look at it, the initial reaction is to say, look, this is at first glance pretty good news. It's sort of a sign of the maturing of the system, right? Proceduralism is a high form of rationality. It shows at least a search for a way forward to ground political obligation or to ground consent or to ground however you want to think about legitimacy when the performative or the political, as you call it, or sort of the substantive, let's say, would be another name for at least some of that, is not sufficient or is not sufficient anymore. But then you get the sense that things are actually not exactly what they seem to be. First of all, because procedure has always been present, has always had a presence in the EU input and output legitimacy discourses. And when I say that sort of that input-output were already quite procedural, at least because they were certainly not substantive or not fully substantive by the standards of what we see substance to mean in national or developed discourses of legitimacy. Substantive, and by substantive here I mean to include both the political and the performative in the way that you have presented it in the slides tonight. The substantive debates in the EU have always been extremely stylized, right? Concerns about the typical substantive concerns about, equality, freedom, dignity, solidarity, have always been, if you want, somewhat depleted or contained by the deep contextualization of the way in which they come up in the EU. So it certainly seems that the supranational level discourses of EU legitimacy have not been a proper site for the full-blown substantive engagement. So the turn to procedure does not come at the end of a serious debate or understanding with the limitations of substance, but rather it's already been prepared by what came before. Why that is so, who knows? Maybe there's been this kind of division of labor in the European discourse, what you call split legitimacy, where so much has been happening at the national level, and there has been a deeply political attempt. And if you look at Germany, which is a place to one should tend to look for these things. If you look at Germany, a deeply political attempt to keep the substantive debate at the national level, with an understanding that if the substantive debate is no longer at the national level, then the nature of the German people will be fundamentally changed, and Germany will and the member states will no longer be democratic. I guess that's the way to put it. So the first one is the procedure was already there in some way. The second point is that the proceduralism here in this kind of turn to procedure that we see with the throughput model is not quite the proceduralism. It sounds different from the proceduralism that we have seen generally in liberal discourse. So typically the way that we tend to think about procedure is that when a political community is basically stuck in some kind of unbridgeable disagreement about substantive matters, a political community that is sufficiently integrated, and it turns to procedure as a way to overcome that kind of disagreement, right? To find a way to keep going. This is how legitimacy, as opposed to justice, enters the discourse of contemporary liberalism. Here the idea is that while we disagree whether we live in societies that are just, because we each have our own conceptions of justice, we should nevertheless be able to agree on some kind of basics. Sure, the systems we live in are not just, but maybe they're legitimate. And if they're legitimate, well, that's enough to just get you going, to ground some kind of obligation, some basics of political authority, if you will. Now, here in the EU, it seems that proceduralism comes in a rather different way. The turn to procedure is itself an instrumental turn. It's a turn where the output can no longer deliver, the input is highly imperfect. So will procedural legitimacy do the trick? And it's hard to see if you understand this in a political way. It's hard to see how, at least to the extent, or in the situations where what's been sort of procedural legitimacy at the supranational level, in the way that you have defined it, efficacy, accountability, transparency, openness, is already met at the national level. So in any functional democracy in the EU, you could tell the story about this kind of throughput legitimacy. It's just that it's not all there is. There's also the input and there's also the output. With a possible interesting footnote that now we do have in the European Union a bunch of member states where these kind of basics of democratic legitimation or the basis of procedural legitimation are no longer in place. So if you look at the way that Hungary, for example, is now being ruled, I don't think that you would find the political processes in Hungary to meet the threshold of openness, transparency, accountability, and efficacy. So it might be that now the EU, and this might explain why support for the European Union in countries like Hungary and Poland is extraordinarily high. Which is really quite baffling. Like, how are these people voting for Orban and Kaczynski, but nevertheless there's great support for the European Union? There's a bit of a paradox there. I want to say a word about this idea of sort of exception, because I found the analysis extremely interesting about the need to discover flexibility when it comes to rules under conditions of crisis. This sense, reading the book and paying attention to the debates and to what's going on, that the actors had, that, you know, the treaty is not a suicide pact. We tend to think about this in the national context. You know, the Constitution is not a suicide pact, which basically means that, look, when it comes to an existential crisis, when the very future of the polity is on the line, then you gotta be flexible. Then you really gotta try to, you know, be playful with some of the rules, be creative in interpretation of the rules. And we do see this, you know, you do see this quite often. You make this really interesting point that what's going on here is not that the EU is making exceptions, but that it's creating exceptional rules. So I found that a really nice, a really interesting way of trying to capture this kind of, not just what's happened during this particular crisis, but really what has been happening during this continuous sort of this series of crises that the EU has been going through. Very quickly, last 2 points. The first one is, reading the book, one gets the sense of the extraordinarily, and I think Daniela alluded to this early on in the introduction, this great complexity. This is an incredibly complex story. It's mind-bogglingly complex. And then you do wonder, you know, at what point does this kind of complexity just, you know, the system just falls apart? It simply cannot take that much complexity. I guess another way of putting this, you know, is to inquire about charisma. There's a great discussion in the book about different kinds of legitimacy. The concept of charisma comes up only once, and I think it's in the discussion of the European Central Bank and Mario Draghi, and he's the only one on whom you put the stamp on he was somewhat charismatic. Nobody else there seems to be particularly charismatic, at least at the supranational level. And, you know, there's a reason for it, because of the way that the procedures are set up. Not to encourage the appointment or the selection of people who are particularly charismatic. And occasionally, whenever there's a name that comes up, you know, I recall the discussion with, should Tony Blair be somehow involved in one of the high positions of authority in the EU? No, the names that come up are not names that you know, you would ever want to have there. But if you could say a little bit more about charisma. Finally, your discussion about multi-speed Europe. And sort of as a model for the future, and as a way of understanding what's already going on in the present. It's already here, sort of different clusters. It would be interesting to think, you know, could these different clusters be sort of ideological competitors to one another? And would they, could different conceptions of legitimacy, different ways in which the performative, the political, and the procedural blend together, could they each establish themselves differently within each of these different clusters, these mini unions, so to speak? Anyway, there would be more, but my time is up.
For now, yes, but we'll come back to this, and we'll have Vivien respond to these questions. Philomila, please.
So let me start by seconding and thirding what Mark and Vlad have already said about the incredible achievement that the book represents in tackling the incredibly complex question of legitimacy and adding nuance to a debate that very often is pretty simplistic. So I really appreciated all of the detailed discussions on particularly on throughput legitimacy and the breaking down of that concept into efficacy, accountability, transparency, inclusiveness, and openness. So, you know, I found that contrary to what the title initially might make you, might make one expect, the book is not a wholesale thumbs down on the question of EU's legitimacy, because it provides a much more nuanced account. In fact, the kind of chart that Vivien presented in her presentation is also included in a different version on page 59 of the book, and it's kind of it's almost like she sets up a machinery through which we can analyze the questions of legitimacy in a very fine-tuned and fine-grained way. So perhaps more importantly, I think the book provides a dynamic picture of legitimacy that shifts with time, which is also very important. So and it breaks it down into the different actors and institutions. So, which kind of solves a little bit of a puzzle. Like if anyone was following the crisis through the media, you would identify this paradox of representation. So the ECB is both a hero and an ogre, the Commission as the Ayatollahs of austerity and also the ministers of moderation. And I think she does an excellent job of accounting for that through the change and shift in time that happened, especially after starting in 2014 and especially after 2015. A couple of observations that have to do with basically my own take on what happened in the crisis and where we may be headed in the current moment. First, I wonder whether I have a much more pessimistic, even descriptive account than Vivien offers. So, for example, while, as she rightly observes, the European semester is no longer simply about austerity or fiscal adjustment, and there has been much that has been written and commented on about the incorporation of the idea of the social into the European semester. My own take on this is more pessimistic in the sense that the social has been incorporated into the European semester, but it has been incorporated in a way that basically empties it of the deeply political redistributive meaning that it used to have, at least within certain constituencies and stakeholders in the debates about social Europe prior to the crisis. So now we have a European semester that incorporates ideas of the social and social policy as the EU thinks the states should be doing it, but it's a concept that is emptied out of the deeply political, deeply redistributive meaning. It's put forth as best practices, and it's emptied out of much discussion about the incredibly deep changes to basic structures of welfare provision within each state that would need to happen for what the European semester puts forward as a goal for everyone. For that to happen, there needs to be like a deep restructuring, which in turn is bound to produce winners and losers, for which there's not much discussion. So, so while I'm saying, there many people see that as a victory and maybe a victory even in throughput legitimacy, but maybe even in outcome legitimacy. I'm a little bit more pessimistic and skeptical about it. I'm on the let's wait and see whether this turns out to be a good thing or a bad thing, basically, because the way that it's being incorporated is kind of like triggering my skepticism. Second, I'm even, I think, more critical about the certain improvements in transparency, the transparency that Vivien identified that happened during the crisis management. So while it may be true that the Commission has increased accountability to other EU agencies and actors, I dare anyone who has not taken an EU law course, or at the very least an EU policy course, in reading and understanding any of the documents produced by the Commission in its efforts to be transparent. So again, while I don't want to underestimate what the change that may have happened and that may be a step in a positive direction, the institutions themselves are so enmeshed in a world and a discourse so closed off from external input that I just don't see how we get from A to B. And I'd love to hear more about what you think about this. So literally, I think it is impossible to read currently like a policy document by the Commission without having read 20 years worth of policy documents by the Commission and knowing what the self-referential phrases and sentences mean, because they date back to, a piling on of, policy documents that come from way back. And that of course relates to like throughput legitimacy and, like the increase in throughput legitimacy. There's a lot of work that needs to be done in, like even opening up participation in EU institutions in terms of, who works there. Just even in terms of, like how representative the body is in terms of the actual population. That's a discussion perhaps for a different time, but I'm just putting it out there to highlight the idea that there's something, still deeply entrenched and closed about the throughput processes of the institutions, even as they are making an effort to change that. Now, I was also going to end up with the question of COVID crisis management and what you thought, like I was like, okay, so you've set up this wonderful machinery. How do you apply it to the current situation? And I take it that you think that, that it's a step forward. I wonder whether you think that that was because of the outcome part, or whether you think that was a step forward in the throughput part. And I'm also wondering how enduring that might prove to be, because my take on this is that I agree that basically the funds that have been put forth and become available, and the speed with which that happened is a stark contrast with what happened with the Eurozone crisis. So that makes me think, okay, why is that happening? And the fact that this is a public health crisis allows the EU institutions to do one thing, which is perhaps get over the moralistic framework of, you didn't work, you didn't do what you were supposed to do, and therefore you're paying the price, because you're talking about a virus that, at least seemingly can affect everyone. Obviously, we know that that's not, that's not entirely right either, but it allows the institutions to get over the blame and fault and moral failure framework that they had set up before. That said, it might actually reinforce that framework in the economy piece. So I'm not sure how they, like whether they work to advance the agenda, or whether they may turn out to consolidate certain ideas that might still be lurking in the background. It remains to be seen. I agree that it's a good thing that that happened fast, but there are also reasons to think that that may not stick necessarily. And finally, I wanted to, as a last little point, I wanted to, you mentioned a few things about the refugee crisis, but I wondered again whether you can take this wonderful machinery and say a few more things about the current moment in the refugee crisis management, which I think kind of combines elements from the Eurozone crisis management, which essentially is, okay, we're not gonna do what we did, we're actually gonna give money to the countries that are managing it, but that's as far as we go. We give you money and you deal with it for us. And the way you deal with it is you actually enclose people in closed structures, you stop their mobility, you deal with them as a potential threat to security, and now even public health. And there's a way in which, Greece for sure is doing that on behalf of the EU, on its own account for sure. I'm not gonna blame everything on EU policy, but certainly, the EU as to the refugee crisis is engaged in a kind of double think, double talk, and non-transparent discourse that at the same time as it heightens emphasis on dignity, human rights, and a basic legal framework, it accepts on the ground a management of the crisis on the part of Greece that is anything but, basically. So I just wonder how your wonderful machinery can be employed to illuminate these new crises that we're dealing with.
Thank you, Philomila. Thank you to the three discussants. This was great. I wanted to maybe add myself to those who've asked questions here to Vivien, and with just one point, which is some of us, I think probably most of us, at least at some point, have been extremely critical of what the European Union was doing. And sometimes I have a sense that post-Brexit and post the beautiful thing that has happened, transfer in the European Union on the occasion of COVID, the abandonment of blame, etc., we, observers of the European Union, are at a stage of uncertainty, not sure how to position ourselves, right? Because we are afraid it may break. And the idea that it may break looks particularly scary when we look at the neighborhood, as Mark was saying at the beginning. The neighborhood is ugly, really ugly. And so we are somehow careful, treading on sort of eggshells here, because we are afraid that critique might destroy what is in the end, in the current landscape, maybe something we need to sustain. Positioning ourselves as sufficiently critical of the enterprise to keep it honest, and at the same time, if possible, and at the same time sustaining what it's doing in a moment in which we need it, is a difficult academic project. And I see Vivien delicately finding a balance, I think much more delicately than most people I know, but it's a difficult balance, isn't it? So please, Vivien, any of this that you've heard in the past half hour, take it wherever you want.
Yeah, well, first, I just want to thank you all for such wonderful remarks. Really excellent in terms of bringing out a whole range of issues that I tried to deal with. So, you know, just to start with Daniela's question, or thank you for saying I managed a delicate balance, Philomila. I find myself extremely critical, but I did have to say that, you know, they're doing this, but so interesting that you don't find me all that critical. Whereas I was simply trying to say, if we're going to talk about legitimacy, I have to lay out all the arguments. But what I did try to end up with was sort of guide the reader to recognize that really awful things happened during the Eurozone crisis, in particular in the first 2 years, and slowly, as Mark said. But the important thing is these institutional actors did learn, slowly but surely, and certainly after 2015, things get better. Nonetheless, none of it's perfect. In fact, there's serious problems still. And my reference to there's still the suboptimal rules. You know, the point is that on the negative side, until COVID, with these suboptimal rules, it meant that countries without what they, you know, euphemistically, here's again the sort of the discourse, the technocratic discourse that hides the truth, so that, you know, they were encouraging countries with fiscal space to invest, with the assumption that those without fiscal space would not. Well, who are those without fiscal space? Well, it's all of Southern Europe, which continued to actually have to do a kind of austerity because they were still pushed to do fiscal consolidation and they could not invest. At the same time, Northern Europeans were not investing. So that, you know, in some ways, this is going to sound terrible, but thank God for the COVID-19 crisis. And I wouldn't be surprised that all sorts of people in the Commission in particular said, oh, wow, here's, you know, finally, we can do something. And this actually speaks to your question, Philomila, but also Mark's in terms of how do we explain these changes and the kind of learning and the fact that all of a sudden you had this massive change. So yesterday I gave a book talk for the Directorate General of Economics and Finance of the Commission, with Marco Butti, who is Director General, who is now Special Advisor, I think he's Chef de Cabinet or Director of Cabinet of Gentiloni, Commissioner of Economics and Finance in the Commission. And he took out one line from the introduction that he found most interesting. And it's really that line which helps respond to Mark and to you, and also actually to Vlad. But how do we explain this and what the sentence was? And I really should develop this more, but this was just kind of a thought I had way back probably in 2015 actually, or 2016. But essentially that what happens in this kind of crisis is that, you know, in a slow burning crisis, so after the massive fast burning crisis, in a slow burning crisis, technical actors have the time to think of new solutions. Political actors won't act except when, especially in the EU, except when there's a fast burning crisis, i.e. when they have to respond. But if they don't have any ideas, they go back to the procedural because they don't, and that's Vlad's question, they don't have any other ideas. And what happened in the Eurozone crisis with this unprecedented crisis, the Commission had no ideas. The political leaders were saying, where are the ideas? What do we do? They didn't get anything from the Commission or the ECB. On the contrary, this was all double down on the rules. And what you got is the member states simply doubled down on the rules, focused on the procedural. But what we saw subsequent to the crisis, and essentially starting in 2014, 2015, you saw the Commission constantly trying to develop new ideas, new initiatives, and they got nowhere. There were resistance in some areas, no question. In other areas, they didn't do a very good job, as in quotas on the migration crisis. But ultimately, I think what we see now is that COVID-19 crisis hits, political leaders, Merkel and Macron, actually recognize that they've got to do something. This is also about the fact that this is a symmetrical shock, not an asymmetrical one. This is about norms and values. The Eurozone crisis for Merkel was, and all Germans was, Schuld, debt, Schuld, shame, sin, bad sinners. And anyway, we don't trust those Southern Europeans, and they spend too much anyway. Slap them down. But what we saw with Merkel this time around, no, it's a shift. It's a humanitarian crisis. It's a health crisis. It's no one's to blame. It's everyone's problem. A bit the way she responded very briefly, initially, in the migration crisis. Humanitarian thing, we'll take a million Syrian refugees. You know, let's not go, you know, let's not think about 3 weeks later when she goes to Turkey and makes the deal with the devil. But you know, basically what we see is there's a shift. But so what you get is Macron and Merkel essentially going forward on their own, so with new ideas. But beyond that, you see the Commission immediately jumping into action. They suspend deficit and debt rules. They use the escape clause, and my understanding is they'd thought about trying to use it before and simply couldn't and didn't, you know, and there's unemployment insurance, and there's a whole range of things that they've been working on for a number of years now and could never get through, and this was the moment. So I think what we can talk about in terms of changes that technical actors were thinking about, what do we do, how do we do it, for a very long time, and preparing for the moment when they could actually do something. Political actors weren't going to do anything until they had to. And, you know, a wonderful moment when they actually did, but nonetheless. So I think this is a really positive moment. And what's interesting is all EU integration theories are wrong because they're all based on failure. You know, whether you talk about the failing forward idea, which is rational choice plus historical institutionalism, you know, incomplete agreements on the member states lead to, you know, problematic reforms by the Commission, and therefore nothing ever happens, but it continues to integrate more. Or you get the core state powers theory that basically nothing's going to work anyway because this is all, well, all of a sudden with COVID, There's no more failing forward. It's, you know, succeeding forward. It's giving up more core state powers at the same time that you reinforce national state powers. You know, it's what I've said years ago about sort of the EU as a region state, which is a regional union of member states where you get increasing integration at the same time you get continuing differentiation. And I think we see that with this. But, and this is in response to Vlad, who said, are there different combinations of input, output, throughput? I think that what we're seeing increasingly is differentiated integration in the EU in terms of different policy areas. I think we've seen the sort of the great leap forward in economic policy. And I think Mark is right, we're not going back, at least fingers crossed, because we did see the neo-Keynesian, you know, after 9 months of neo-Keynesianism, 2008, 2009, all of a sudden that ends and we get austerity. So that's why I worry 2 to 3 years down the road, someone may, you know, austerity may rear its ugly head again, but I don't think so, because I think there has been a clear recognition. This is serious learning on the part of everyone. And this is also about being in a bad neighborhood, bad global, you know, context, China, Trump, Russia, Libya, Erdogan, all of this, I think, means that the EU needs to hold together. And I think Mark is right that what's extraordinary is that it's done more in these past, at least in terms of promises, than we've seen over the past 10, if not 20 years of, you know, of crises and failures, which is not to say that Philomila is wrong to be highly critical. And certainly when we get back to the social policy issue, and I do try to say that there's a real problem with the social policy and this kind of the structural reforms, because they're highly neoliberal and they're not doing anything. And what you see is we've seen increasing inequalities, et cetera. But, you know, maybe, and it seems to me that COVID is kind of the wake-up call, we've got to do something. And it may be because of enlightened self-interest. Merkel got calls from auto manufacturers saying, you've got to save Italy because that's where our suppliers are. Plus, we need to sell our cars all over Europe. So you can say enlightened self-interest. But also it's sort of a question of shared values and a recognition that you can't have, you know, continued rising inequalities. And the populist revolt, there are good reasons for it in terms of the rising inequalities, and not just between North and South, but internally in all of these countries, including in Germany. Something needs to be done. And at the same time, we haven't talked about climate change. And everyone knows how serious that is. And I think that sort of the notion that we'll spend the money, that the EU will spend the money on, I think 30% is going to be green bonds for the Green New Deal. It's going to be about digitalization, serious health policy, et cetera. You know, I just hope that fiber comes to my part of Italy here. But you know, this is it's a serious problem, especially in the midst of COVID. Students, kids, all over Europe in rural areas are not getting, you know, can't follow classes online, let alone be able to do Zoom seminars like ours. So I think I've responded as much. Is there anything else? Yeah, I think I've
covered quite some ground. So I see a question, how much do you think the differentiated policy can take us, specifically in regards to the bad neighborhood? See, for example, Germany's take on Turkey versus France's take on Turkey. So is the differentiated policy going to solve effectively the problems that arise from in those areas vis-a-vis, for instance, Turkey?
No, it's a very good question. And that gets me back to some of the other issues with immigration. I think that in certain areas, the EU is still not going anywhere. In the pandemic, what we've seen is a great leap forward in terms of economic policy, in terms of digitalization, probably in terms of Green New Deal and all of that. Migration policy, yes, they're going to get rid of the Dublin Accords. I don't know if they're going to solve this anytime soon. Hopefully what we'll see is something better, but a little better, but not clear. With regard to foreign policy as well, that's differentiated integration where there's certainly not going to be that much integration. I think the only thing you can say is the member states, this is really an area of core state powers where the member states are the ones that are largely in control. But, security and defense, there's not been any move forward there. And yet the EU is in a dangerous neighborhood. But perhaps that will come. My impression is that there is a good sense that actually the EU now is in it all together. And that was Mark's remarks earlier. So I think more cooperative engagement, more positive integration in some areas may lead to, dare I say this, spillover into other areas. But those are still very slow in coming. The member states, certainly in terms of security and defense, it's not moving forward anywhere. And Brexit is probably an issue. And on Brexit, just one comment. I think I was asked a question in another webinar. Did I think that Brexit was probably a good thing for the EU? Because otherwise the EU would never have made this deal. And so that's what everyone is saying. And yes, probably that's true, that Boris Johnson and any UK prime minister would have vetoed any deeper integration, would have made a deal with the Frugal Four and made it impossible to have happen what happened. On the other hand, if you look at what Boris Johnson has been saying, he's been saying along with his Svengali, Dominic Cummings, that what they want, the reason they need to leave the EU is because they want to be able to do lots of state aid to the north of England, and they want to do growth and all of that. And so it's conceivable that had the UK not been Brexiting, Boris Johnson would say, yes, let's spend more. Okay. Pie in the sky.
Mark, you were particularly restrained at the beginning with your time. Would you like to respond to Vivien's comments?
Well, I think that everyone, in particular Philomila, has really hit the nail on the head here. Are we looking at the proverbial glasses becoming half full, or is the remaining third being poured out? And, there's more than enough data points out there where we can basically pick exactly the one that you want. And maybe this is a bias for hope because I've just spent so long through the austerity book, through the future of the Euro book, just looking at this thing and going, oh no, another train wreck's coming along, right? And, I'm living in a country where, if you look at Twitter just now, you will honestly find that the words Hitler Youth, Patriotic Education, Trump are actually trending, right? So things aren't looking good here. They're really not. And maybe it's just a bias on my side, but I think that the combination of the realization that they're all in it together, the positive side of the Hotel California problem, and the fact that the neighborhood really has changed, has forced attention in a way that it hasn't done before. And we're absolutely right. You still have the French on one side of the Turkish question, and the Germans on the other. Nobody knows what to do with Libya. They still have absolutely no idea what to do with refugees. But the first step is to recognize that there is a problem and at least taking the first step. So I'm going to stay on the optimistic side. And I think that what Vivien's book has allowed me to do is, despite the fact it's about the past, is to be slightly more optimistic about the future.
Vlad, closing remarks.
Sorry, I was struck by the conversation about a bad neighborhood and about your question, Daniela, of how all of a sudden now people are, we're all jumping to the defense of the EU. It's interesting. I guess it's part of the ironies of history, right? We tended to think about 1989 and the revolutions of 1989 as these very odd things. Those people didn't really want anything different. no new way of structuring political power. All they wanted was the return to normality. Well, that's just not enough to make for a serious revolution, you know, like the French Revolution, the American Revolution. You need something more to make for a revolution. Now, all of a sudden, what we're basically hearing from all these besieged, you know, Western democracies under distress, including the structure of the EU, is some sort of, look, let's just make sure that we keep things going, right? Because they can really fall apart. It can really go bad. You know, we live in a bad neighborhood. Just imagine if the European project was to fall apart. So this is a strange call. I mean, you can refer to it as the call to, you know, preserve normality or some version of it. And you know, sure, there's so much that ought to be done, that is essential to be done at the level of the EU. But one fears, you know, you look at the recent discourse of the President of the European Commission about the state of the EU, the discourse that she gave in Parliament not long ago, and before you would think of it, you know, at variations of this kind of speech, the way that Philomila was talking, you got to go back and see how these people have been talking. You look at the previous iterations of speeches like that, and you would say, oh, you know, general, abstract, not good. But then you read the recent speech under the pressures of the historical moment, and then you fear, you know, if this thing is to fall apart, if it is to fragment, disintegrate, to come, you know, to not withstand the kind of pressures of history, then the world would be worse off, then Europe would be worse off. So there's something to really protect here. And then it becomes a question of ideas, and of will. I mean, the reason why, you know, there's another crisis we haven't yet mentioned, the rule of law crisis in Poland, Hungary. The reason why the EU is not responding to it appropriately, I don't think it's because of a lack of ideas. It's really just a lack of political will. So it's this combination of ideas, imagination, and political will.
Philomila, word on.
So apologies for my connection. I have been following everything through the phone, mostly because I've been kicked in and out of the actual Zoom meeting. It's kind of strange for me to end up still being the worst pessimist of everyone. But after listening to everyone in these comments, I had the thought that perhaps the reason why it might all fall apart, legitimation might work for the EU, is that it kind of represents a return to basics for Europe. So if the idea was, oh, we will all kill each other if we don't get into this thing together, then perhaps this moment represents a really minimal return to basics that might work for Europe. I mean, political theorists keep saying that you need positive ideals of integration. It can't just be a threat. In the background, you need people to work towards something positive. Well, maybe that's not true for Europe. Maybe keeping the region from devolving into what we've seen before is good enough. So I don't know, this was great food for thought for me. I really need to, work more on what I think about this, but it was amazing.
We need to let Vivien go to sleep. I said around 12:30 we would wrap up for her. I just wanted to say that I am a bit, so what the neighborhood lesson teaches us is interesting. In particular, the neighborhood where we are, where everybody except for Vivien is living now. This is a situation where we wonder whether the problem was precisely what Europe may be guilty of, which is believing in a soft version of the social to keep society together. Because this is what liberal democracy has done to America for many years, and we are discovering it really, we are seeing how it really didn't work, right? So we don't want Europe to kid itself into believing that some middle way social policy is going to prevent the country from worse crisis, because history is proving that that's not the way to do it. That's my sense from the neighborhood discussion. Vivien, the last word is to you.
Yeah. So just to outdo Philomila on pessimism, So I see COVID as a great opportunity, but this doesn't just depend on the EU and continuing to move forward. I mean, the supranational actors, because von der Leyen's speech was fantastic, and it hit all of the right buttons in terms of liberal democracy, in terms of ambitious move forward in all the right directions on climate change, on digitalization, on migration, on rule of law, etc. But what happens, not only Orban and Kaczynski in Hungary and Poland remain, but what happens if Marine Le Pen wins in France the next time around? Matteo Salvini, the current government is pretty shaky. Matteo Salvini in Italy. And one can go on, look at countries, most Central and Eastern European countries are a bit iffy in all of it. So what if, as Orban has called for, what if the EU turns illiberal? Where do we go from there? This is about, and these things can change very quickly. So the EU may finally have gotten it right on the economics, but it may be too late because you've got lots of angry people voting for anti-system parties that are challenging the EU, although they're not saying it anymore, or they're saying, no, we want to be part of the EU, we just want a different EU. We want an illiberal EU, an EU of different kinds of values, our illiberal values. That's a serious problem. And that also could happen. Hopefully not. And in a way, I see the response to COVID-19 as a kind of a recognition that it's not just about we need better economics because we're not growing, but we also need better politics because the danger of anti-system politics is all around. So maybe is that pessimistic enough, Philomila?
That's enough to end on.
Yes, I think this is, so this is basically an advertisement for your book, your Transatlantic Reflection on Populism. We look forward to reading that, Vivien. Thank you so much for this, as always, extremely interesting. It's been a pleasure to work with you all, guys. Thank you for the discussion.